We need to talk about something interesting.
Thanks everybody for sticking with me on this. Seems like you guys are enjoying the format and what we're covering here. I felt bad because in the last episode I didn't really get to all the shot composition and directing tricks that I really wanted to talk about, and I noticed some additional theming stuff that I really wanted to hit on too, but we can do that over the course of this episode. When editing, the shot composition thing that I really wanted to point out is kind of the symbol of leading someone in the previous episode. In the beginning, when they are talking about what they're making a wish, they're all walking abreast, which shows them kind of on the same level because they're all kind of considering this problem of making a wish. And nobody is really ahead of the other. We touched on walking in place versus actually making progress across the screen directionally, but also really wanted to highlight that later in the episode when Madoka is convinced of Mami's values, that she follows behind Mami. I don't think I gave enough weight to that movement being different from the previous movement, as well as the stopping and turning around, possibly calling back to episode 1. As we see Mami's feet featured a number of times. And when Kyosuke is brought up, Sayaka stops in the same way that Mami stops. All this stopping and starting is very revelatory for what the characters value and what stops them in their tracks. And that's not even to say just the basic thing of walking versus running throughout all this episode, the low pace throughout most of it. How that reflects onto being a magical girl and struggling with the values and making progress forward slowly and steadily and waking up each day to attack what's in front of you. And heck, we could even tie this in with Magia and Madoka becoming faster and running as the song goes on. One comment I wanted to point out was from Angel Dude 101 on YouTube. They state that perhaps Kyoko is really the only person who really comes to believe in the value of redemption, which absolutely is something we will absolutely get to that. Spoilers, but episode 9 is actually my favorite episode for precisely this reason and more. Their comment also mentions how ridiculously common this thing is and how they noticed it in Lyrical Nanoha, which absolutely, it does become a meme, and absolutely A's, I think, is the best one for watching Lyrical Nanoha in general, and really watch the recap movie of the first season if you guys are looking forward to that. And Ruby was the other thing that they mentioned, and yeah, I could talk about this in length in its own video, but what defines a magical girl show and the values espoused in are not limited to frilly dresses. A friend named Contessa once made this, and she was nice enough to consult me on that, and it just kind of breaks open that idea of what makes a magical girl show and how they can be somewhat different than you might imagine. Ruby doesn't actually stray that far artistically from what we would know as pretty standard. And of course, Mani Ohm was well known for liking this type of aesthetic and the types of values of these shows. It's very easy to trace influences throughout the magical girl genre. They're very clear. But when Ruby hits at its core and it gets those themes, I think a lot of the writing of Ruby is really bad, but that's for another video. But when it strikes, when it does have that heart, it is definitely right in line with all the values of the magical girl show. And I even bring it up times as memes, but Evangelion is something literally Word of God influenced very heavily by watching the original's run of Sailor Moon, and he's a big fan. Or I even consider Devilman Crybaby a magical girl show. The values that Miki has in those shows and how they're presented and how they're kind of torn down. It doesn't kind of end on that, spoilers, but it gets there and it shows the value of those even if they aren't allowed to exist. And we can go straight on down the line to Little Witch Academia, to Kill la Kill, to Pretty Sammy or something. Yeah, so how vulnerability can become a strength, how it can nonsensically create the miracles and magic just by believing in them. Heck, that's something we'll get to in this episode, right? I mean, we better, it's literally the title. But prior to talking directly about Madoka Magica, I'd just like to give a little bit of time to why these values are preeminent in the genre, or how has this same thing applied to Nephrite and Naru back in season 1 of Sailor Moon, but then Also applied to General Ironwood in Season 7 of RWBY that aired in 2020. I actually had the pleasure and the boon of having a very long and involved discussion with one of my friends, a man by the name of Seifu. He has taken in recent years to doing some manga analysis that you may like if you like thinking about things critically, and the comic books and the whatnot. Well, Seifu's favorite anime of all time is Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann. Mine is definitively not Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann, even though I do count Hiroyuki Imaishi as one of my favorite directors ever. And the disparity there is because the values of TTGL are so different from the values of my favorite anime of all time, Madoka Magica. I think the disparity is fairly obvious to anyone that's watched both series, but our discussion really led me to thinking about the shows and why we were champions of those shows, or why those shows' values that we internalized matched our worldviews. And I don't mean to mislabel or misgender these, but I've always seen TTGL as a masculine show, or one with masculine values. And those are, nobody can stop you, right? The values break through. The values you'll find if you listen to TTGL for like 2 seconds, they're very clear there. And those values are internal, or what I like to call intrapersonal. They are related to other people because that's one of the barriers you have to overcome, but they are only for you to solve. Seifu was of the opinion that that type of attitude, or attacking those types of limitations, are something that all human beings need to do, or something that rung true for his experiences and his life more than anything else. Of course, I agreed that that's what Gurren Lagann is absolutely trying to do, and the message it's trying to convey. I simply just disagree with that message. And I want to make this specifically clear. It wasn't that the nonsense can happen. I'm of course fine with the nonsense existing and it creating a new future. However, if you look at Madoka Magica and any magical girl show, it's the inherent value interpersonally between the characters that creates the miracles and magic. That there's a trust in that and a belief in that in other people, not the inherent strength of one person alone, or humanity as their gestalt, but the very specific and targeted bonds between the characters are what give the miracles and magic their power and their legitimacy. The compassion and understanding that a character shows to the other people that they interact with, and how that paradoxically creates the outcome that they wish to see in the world. In that way, it's kind of exactly similar, but also the complete antithesis of Gurren Lagann's view. And I think it's really important to point out how it's different from something where this type of compassion is shown in a shonen series, like, say, at the end of the Saiyan saga when they spare Vegeta's life. If you've already resolved the conflict with the physical violence, then the compassion has no purpose or meaning. It's only by putting irrational faith behind the goodness of other people and having hope and faith in them, and how that outweighs the force that's going to be used. But that's an idea for episode 11, which you want to keep in mind. In summary, why is the idea of redeeming the bad guy so core to the magical girl genre? Because it is a genre that places heavy emphasis on the interactions between the characters and those interpersonal, traditionally feminine associated values. Because it's not Gurren Lagann. And I do think that if you're making a magical girl show, no matter if it's in, 1992 or 2020, I think you're going to need to understand how magical girls solve their problems. And it's not by any internal power, and it's not by physical might. Before, again, we get into the episode, there was one other thing that I kind of wanted to go into a little bit more depth in episode 3 that I failed to, and I'm very sorry for. In discussing this irrationality and Kyubei's opposition to that, in mentioning the paradox of belief as a purpose in an uncaring and unjust world, I failed to mention my favorite quote of all time of anything ever. Some of you may already know it. It's from Terry Pratchett's The Hogfather, as the character of Death talks to his granddaughter Susan. It goes as follows. "All right," said Susan, "I'm not stupid. You're saying humans need fantasies to make life bearable. Really, as if it were some kind of pink pill. No, humans need fantasy to be human, to be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape." So tooth fairies, hog fathers, little... Yes, as practice, you have to start out learning to believe the little lies, so we can believe the big ones. Yes, justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing. Oh, they're not the same at all. You think so? Then take the universe and grind it down in the finest powder and sieve it through the finest sieve, and then show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy. And yet, Death waved a hand, and yet you act as if there is some ideal order in the world, as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged. Well, yes, but people have got to believe that, or else what's the point? My point, exactly. End quote. You should all definitely check out the works of Terry Pratchett if you haven't already. He was one of the people who got it, and I think this quote really encapsulates everything about the worldview that is prevalent in magical girls. I asked this question to my friends the other day. If there was some type of alien intelligence, if there was, a constructed AI, artificial intelligence that comes up in the future, in a science fiction-esque setting, is it possible that they understand the world as Cube's race understands the world, completely devoid of emotions, or as Terry Pratchett states, completely unwilling to believe the little lies and the big ones? Is that inherently a human thing? Or I think the more optimistic outlook, and the one I like better, is that this way of kind of rationalizing an uncaring and unjust world is something that all intelligences would go through, or would be intrinsic to survival for any intelligent civilization. This is one of the things I consider closest to a universal truth for human beings, that whether we like to or not, we behave on codes of conduct. We make judgments and value judgments and act on those. We facilitate our own rights and wrongs, like we talked about in the previous episode. I think what this media does that I like to consume is respect that and elevate that and show the really human struggle to pursue that and live those values. And so in episode 3 and 4 of Madoka Magica, we are stuck on this question of purpose and finding something true enough to dedicate yourself to and believe in. That I think the lens I want to use to start talking about episode 4 is Sayaka's struggle to create that, to really start to become a human being, to act, to make a judgment. I promise I'll talk about the onus to action and how it relates to the characters later on. Beginning the play-by-play here, fantastic opening for this episode. Of course, we have the establishing shot, the setting, the hospital once again, but this time colored in a sunset as opposed to the bright daylight we saw it in earlier. It's a bit of a dead horse, but again, I'll comment how much this feels like a play. And all that talk we had about the walking, the movement, the slow pacing of it in the previous episode is all thrown out the window or directly contrasted here. Shots of Sayaka's feet as she runs forward to the left. If we put these two symbols of the time of day and this movement together and contrast them with episode 3, we see now that this is tonally going to be more dire and serious. It's a falling action or a descent, and it has a lot more intensity to it too. And that's all within the first 10 seconds. We'll acknowledge that this shot is the same camera angle as we saw in episode 3, and that the wind is the same. This, of course, puts emphasis on what has changed, namely that there are no humans in the shot. Really like the composition of this shot right here. It gives a lot of space to this hallway, makes it feel overwhelming, and the horizon vanishing point being off screen gives it this element of instability. Really helps us get a little perspective on Sayaka's feelings, and having only the barest suggestion of the nurses talking to Sayaka, even as their voices are heard, is a great way of marginalizing them and saying they're not important. Color palette being so effective here too, again, with the character cell animation being so very different than the background art. And it's kind of meaningful too that she walks away from the nurses and into the light at the end of the tunnel here. It's like the light being, happiness or goodness or some type of positivity is there, it exists, but it's outside of the realm of wherever these characters are dwelling. Or, Sayaka knows that happiness is somewhere to be found. She's just trying to walk towards it, but not getting very far. It's mirrored in the scene with Kyosuke in the physical therapy room. The washed out nature of the windows really shows that there is light all around them, just not shining on them. The nurses dump the exposition, of course, that there was an accident and that he'll never actually be able to play again. I mean, we kind of already knew this from the previous episode, but it's to confirm that it's an absolute here, even as we see him struggle in physical therapy, that there is no hope for him ever naturally recovering without Sayaka's wish. And sad violins. I mean, when we get to episode 8 and 9, we do want to talk about Sayaka's theme or Octavia von Seckendorf's theme. But right now, just the violins being associated with Sayaka is enough to know that obviously, like, her whole thing is based on this wish for this violin player that affected her as a child and, her relationship with him. So using violins could not be more obvious in that way as a symbol. However, and I could be wrong on this because I know absolutely nothing about anything, but I believe this note is too low to be played on a violin. After doing some research, it seems like the track is called Serena Ira, which means serene anger in Latin. And the track is performed on cello. Now, your traditional string quartet is made up of 2 violin players, a viola and a cellist. Your cello forming the bass and almost never taking front and center. While it certainly can be used solo to great effect and setting a great mood, as we see here, it's a supportive instrument. So that song really fits with Sayaka. It really fits her supporting Kyosuke in his violin role, and it also mirrors her serene anger that she has for the situation that Kyosuke has been put in. Keep in mind, this isn't Sayaka's theme, it's not Octavia's theme either, but those definitely feature very heavily on the string component as well, and this is kind of maybe in some way a prequel to those. And this sad cello goes on for the next minute as we see Sayaka descending in an elevator. Now, I tried not to be like super obvious in these, at the risk of sounding super obvious here, or super haughty if I don't point it out and just say it's obvious. Anytime you have somebody descending in an elevator, that's such an easy and understandable and workable symbol for mirroring a character's emotional state that it really can't be misinterpreted, or would be very difficult to misinterpret or use in a separate way, especially with a sad cello, especially with this kind of framing that traps her in there, especially with the continuation of the light not directly shining on her, especially with her monologue. Another really elementary but really effective technique in directing, and you see a lot in anime, is that anytime you cut out the character's eyes, it's universally signaling some type of discontent, dishonesty, negative emotions in some way. And there's any number of examples even within the show itself, but of course we could connect it to the end of episode 8 very easily. And we'll come back to what she's actually saying in her monologue here, but I want to skip to the end right before the credits come in. She breaks the fourth wall. She becomes a narrator. She says, "Now that I think about it, I really didn't understand anything back then. And I cannot overstate how much I love this choice." So first we have the diegesis angle that we've been talking about, and we mentioned even as far back as the opening scene, that we are to view this as a play, and how we will be constantly reminded that that is the case. And now they've used the voice acting to change our perspective and remove us again from the situation, to distance us from what's happening here. This is very important to come after that everything we talked about with episode 3 and how it hit people emotionally and got people very invested with it. We'll continue to talk about how much the show gains by putting this distance between the viewer and the characters, but right now it's to have sympathy and not empathy. You should say this situation sucks instead of crying alongside of her. I don't actually remember what our hypothesis was for why they go about doing this in episode 1, but I like to think now that it's kind of become clear that we're forcing ourselves out of that direct empathy in order to see this as systemic or something that happens continuously or that is just another drop in the bucket. I think that becomes a little more apparent later on as more of the intricacies of the magical wheel system is revealed to Sayaka and to us. I think another aspect it could be is that it makes makes it harder to get to that ultimate compassion that Madoka does. The answer isn't feeling sympathy for Sayaka, right? It's not. Madoka's apotheosis is not grounded in the idea that she truly does care for everyone. It is, of course, that is the large factor, but the idea is grounded in the fact that she can see it as systemic and she can view it all in total, or she can take that larger perspective that Homura's action allows her to do, which we definitely talked about in the last episode. Madoka Kaname already has the empathy piece of the puzzle, and I think getting to the part where we talk about the systemic injustices that the magical girls will face, instead of just the events that happen to Sayaka, then we begin to unlock the second piece of that puzzle. And then we begin to come to a place where we can see the answer, or the forest through the trees. The second part of what I love about this is that it breaks the scope, or it deliberately infringes on the established storytelling conventions for this show. This act is so cool to me as a viewer, or a critic of the conventions of storytelling, in the fact that they are not doing it without a purpose, right? They are not doing this. It's clearly not just a mistake. It's clearly deliberately knowing the conventions, knowing what's best when you're telling a story. You don't change perspectives, or you don't change your point of view as you're writing your novel or as you're filming your film. And it's generally accepted that that's a correct thing to do in storytelling. Yeah, and everybody from Stephen King to Quentin Tarantino will tell you, and have told you in their books and their interviews, that you have to know the rules before you can go about breaking them. And that's exactly what's happening here, that they're deliberately choosing to do the incorrect thing in storytelling for a purpose. And that is what makes it artistic. That makes it a choice. That makes it powerful. And it calls out the fact here. It highlights it in a way that says infinitely more than if they had done it another way. And just that simple transgression against the established conventions of the story so far is in and of itself something laudable and interesting, even divorced of what it says for the show itself. But after those two things, even after the diegesis and the just simple transgression, we actually have to also consider the subtext of it. Sayaka is narrating. The first thing we see after Mommy dies is that Sayaka has taken over this story. Like, actually, literally taken it over. That's powerful in and of itself. However, her message in this is also extremely morose. She's basically telling you that this is going to end badly. Now, of course, that's been hinted at in the previous episodes, of course. But here it makes it kind of definitive, right? How can we honestly go through episodes 4 through 9 and, have any type of expectations when we've already been spoiled about it by the very character herself? This is probably another element of tying back into the diegesis. The point we're supposed to take away is that it's not about that emotional moment by moment element. Do not consume this on its basis level, this is telling you. And here's the real powerful thing. Here's what I love episode 9 so much, is because that, after all of that happens, after Sayaka's wish goes south and she loses her soul gem darkens and, she loses all faith in anything that she sets out to do in this episode, we still, at every turn, think this is where it's going to turn back. This is when it's going to resolve. This is when it's going to flip, and there's going to be this message of hope. When Kyoko says, it'll be like one of those stories where love and justice triumph, in episode 9, when they go to try and turn her back, we're still thinking that it is going to be that. Even though Sayaka's saying right here, nah, my story doesn't end like that. Sorry. Now, I think that the Sayaka who is narrating here is a Sayaka that is before Madoka's wish. Or that the scene in the theater with Marukami reconciling Sayaka with everything that happened to her, that doesn't seem very congruent with what the person who's speaking at episode 4 right here. And yeah, I think that's something we should remember for episode 12 when we get there. Kind of the idea that exists as outside of the actual story of Madoka Magica, or as a coda. And I guess that brings us into talking about the content of this, right? What it meant to pray for a miracle, or the price of one. And in the episode called Miracles and Magic Do Exist, we're going to talk a lot about cost and the fallacious nature of that. But now we're grounded in that. We're grounded in it being a sad cost, it being a sad, melancholy wish, and this idea of nothing comes easy or nothing comes free. So before we get off of this scene, and I know, geez, it's already, 25 minutes into the episode, and we're still not even past the first 2 minutes. But we have to address the content of what Sayaka is saying. She says to herself in this elevator, if I make a wish for Kyosuke, what will he think? This is inherently a value judgment, you know? She knows what Mami will think. She knows what Madoka would think. And that's kind of setting up this false dichotomy, right? Of like the Kyosuke's respect or love or admiration versus, her own guilt for making a wish for somebody else, or, her knowing in some way that it's a bad idea. And the stress that she feels is very much, I think, because she already knows that she's made the choice. She already knows that it's not going to be something that's going to fulfill her and give her purpose. So I think her upsettedness here is that she isn't stronger, or she isn't better, or she doesn't have anything better to fight for. She knows that that's weak. But it's not, judging by our metrics last time, it's not what she makes the wish for, or what she fights for, or what she dedicates her life to. It's that she's 100% behind it, It's that Mami quote from last episode. It's just apparent that she already knows that Kyosuke alone isn't going to be enough by her own metrics. There's also kind of this element, too, of it matching the despair or incoming despair from the monologue and the tone of everything. I'm reminded of the classic Greek tragedy, your Oedipus Rex and all that, where the audience would come into the performance of the play knowing full damn well that it was going to be a tragedy and wasn't nobody going to be happy. And it was only really the how that goes about it, How does Sayaka's wish fail to provide her with the motivation to continue living? How are the things changed around her, or the deceptions too much for her to bear? And the diegesis, the removal of us from the situation, adds into that. It asks us to read it as inevitable, so we only need to worry about the how, not exactly the what. Or we need to worry about the themes instead of the actions. Man, the entire thing, so good. I think one of the impressive things that the opening manages to do over the course of the show is change based on the context. Watching this through after Mami's death, we kind of get a lot more out of the small bits of struggle that Madoka does in this opening. We are also revealed or confused by the end shot of them on top of the radio tower. What's going on? So that was a fucking lie? Or is the show in some way going to recant and go back and be like, oh no, Mami was not dead all along? And we very quickly see that tonally that's not the case. The brilliance and sterility of the Kaname house, how all the colors and the lighting are back already, and Madoka's family operate normally and happily, clearly show that it's something she's not going to share with her family. And this next shot is going to tell us how severely we are going to take this. It could be any range of things. Like, we really need to contextualize what this death meant, or like how severe this death is going to be to these characters, and that will inform how we as the audience should see it. So what does Shinbo give us here? He gives us the yellow of the egg in a basic color callback, and kind of a shape of Mami's hairpin too, which I don't think we've mentioned it before, and it might be relevant for the semiotics of this egg, but Mami stores her soul gem, the actual gem part of it, in her hairpin when she is transformed. Sayaka, of course, wears hers near her belly button. Madoka wears hers on a chokra around her neck. Homer wears hers on the back of her hand. I've heard it suggested that Mami's body was immediately dead because Charlotte ate her head, and that the soul gem was on the head, which I guess, yeah, but I don't know that we need to go into that level of depth. But yeah, if the soul gem breaks, as we see in Kyoko's sacrifice, that the magical girl immediately dies. I don't think we're informed enough about the symbol yet in this part of the film, so I don't really think they're implying that that's, any type of connection there past just the basic color and shape maybe. But there it is. So great shot, great for the scene, great to find something that would remind Madoka of Mami in the context of her having breakfast with her family. And just a beautiful directing choice to get this hit of the music, this one little bell chime, the dung, and an immediate cut to Madoka's face in shadows and her soulless, lifeless stare as she looks at the egg. So now we have a perspective. We know that it is grief time. We know that the show is not just going to move past this very quickly. It was an action, mommy dying, with a lot of weight behind it for the characters, and that needs to be explored. Or maybe not needs to, but the show is going to explore it in depth. The first kind of thing that happens in regards to Madoka with that is her line of, "Yes, I'm alive and your cooking tastes so good, Dad." You know, mommy's only wish was to remain alive, and the whole thing of Homer's actions, valuing Madoka's ability to have this normal everyday life and, you know, not get caught up in her eventual and inevitable demise if she becomes a magical girl. We see we're already operating in that, you know, we're already putting heavy value on those elements, and Madoka definitely already knows that, and knows that mommy will not have that anymore, and what a severe loss that is. The next scene kind of shows that Sayaka is putting it out of mind, or is not willing to face these feelings just yet. The other thing about this is a term I've made up called focalization, and it's basically whose point of view are we following. And in this scene, we're in Madoka's, even though Sayaka was narrating the previous scene and would seem to have been who we are following for this episode. It's kind of strange then that we won't follow Sayaka, excepting in the one scene where she interacts with Kyosuke again. There might be something to be said about Sayaka's ability and willingness to put on a face here, but I would interpret that as just kind of a general coping mechanism, or Madoka being more honest with this type of tragedy than Sayaka is, or knowing how to deal with it better. You know, I think the next shot is kind of really good for pacing, but not much else. You have the joke of the character of the teacher, and that's neither here nor there, right? It's so detached from everything that's going on or anything meaningful in this thing that it's really just a tonal pull out and an adjustment of scope of like, how do you go back to normalcy after what happened? And that's why it's great for the pacing, because it's hard to watch, just like it's hard for the characters to sit through this nonsensical lesson. It's hard for us to sit through as well. It's kind of interesting how divorced the teacher's nonsense about finding someone who will love her as an old fruitcake is from what is going through the minds about what's meaningful in the magical girls. All right, let's talk shot composition again here. Obviously, direct callback to episode 2. The birds even fly off in the same way. If you'll remember in that scene, mommy was not a participant. She looked on from afar. The setting, again, is completely the same. Nothing's tarnished. It's no shadows, you know? But look in the direction that the girls are looking. Madoka back and right, Sayaka forward and left. You know, again, if we write in Japanese from right to left, right is always backwards, left is progress and forwards. Sayaka is, in this episode, going to be the one that takes the action here, and Madoka is the one that's going to be kind of looking back and saying, what went wrong? Also extremely relevant that they are looking separate, or they are looking different directions, and you can even see that in the shot with them together. They have different perspectives. We've been talking about this ongoing, so it's no surprise that they wouldn't be looking at each other and trying to console each other, because they think about things differently already, or they've already been growing apart over the course of the last couple episodes. Also, very quickly, take a look at the shot composition of the background here. It is warped. It is like Madoka is sitting in a bowl here. Same with Sayaka, that the lines aren't perpendicular or parallel to each other. They kind of spread out. Also, that this shot composition leaves them enclosed in the cage, whereas there is in the other shots all this open, wide open potential above them. You don't see that in this shot. Here's the thing about their dialogue. They first start out lamenting the fact that they have lost their innocence, that they now know about the witches, that they now know about all the evils in the world, and they recognize this information as a burden. They can't just go on living their lives without any type of allowance towards this type of goings on. That's exactly what Homer was talking about in the first episode, when she said, you know, if you value all this stuff, don't change, don't go on, don't learn about any of it. That's Homer's whole thing in this timeline, is to stop and keep Madoka innocent. I think this is really related to adolescence and growing up. As a child, you don't have the facilities to really understand the world, or, you know, you haven't encountered the elements of the world that we feel would need to be changed. And that duty to act is now what they're going to be struggling with. And the perspectives on that are a large part of why they'll grow grow apart. Now, here's the thing. Sayaka makes a logical error. She makes an informed assumption that is incorrect. She says, you and me, we're the only ones who know about witches and stuff. This is very much in line with kind of her hero complex, or maybe that's a little too strong, but like her type of handle it herself. No one else can do anything, or the pressure that she feels to be able to make her will known, or take advantage of what she's been given. I mean, it's demonstrably not true. Kyoko comes on to the end of the episode, but even past that, there would be no reason why you wouldn't assume there'd be more magical girls that exist in the world, or that they wouldn't go hunt where their prey is. Let's now talk about Kyubey and how it is so distant from the girls on the screen. Sayaka mentions, would you like to become a magical girl? And now Kyubey is introduced into the shot and introduced and a little bit closer to them. Also, look at the perspective here. The camera has zoomed back behind Kyubey so that it appears about as large as both Madoka and Sayaka combined. Again, just a very basic visual storytelling trick is that if a thing is big on the screen, it is important to what is going on in that moment. So here's the thing that happens with Madoka and why they kind of split, or why Sayaka makes her wish later on. Think about this. Madoka is honest that she does not want to be a magical girl if somebody like Mami gets the short end of the stick, or gets obliterated. If the values that Mami espoused and that Madoka supported at the end of last episode aren't enough to triumph, then Madoka doesn't have anything, or she would behave in the same way as Mami and she would meet the same end as Mami. Now, we know that's not the case because of how Madoka behaves with Homura already. She would have met a different end if Madoka were the one in Mami's situation last episode, because she would have trusted Homura. But because of this Gen Urobuchi hoodwink that we talked about at the end of last episode, the correlation is kind of strong to Mami's values of helping other people and trying to be somebody who is a good person to dying. It's understandable, and it's understandable that she would share her vulnerability with her best friend, of course. Why wouldn't she? It's then understandable that Sayaka would then see Madoka's vulnerability and know that she's too pure to risk that type of lifestyle, and that if somebody must fill the void that Mami left, it would be her. If you think about it in that way, doesn't Sayaka do exactly what Homura does? Doesn't she stop Madoka from having to make her wish? That's a pretty funny thought. She makes her wish for Kyosuke, of course, and we'll get to that scene, but, I think this is just as much an influence on her. And, wanting to become like Mami is just as much an influence on her for her decision to make her wish in this episode as anything with Kyosuke. It goes back more to the innocence, more to the, duty to act, more to the using your wish as becoming somebody that you want to be, and finding something to believe in and live that truth. But I think a lot of people going through the show have this idea that it's just about the selfish wish and the guilt she feels by being so selfish. I want to point this out, that Sayaka is not a failure as a person or a magical girl, or she's very understandable, right? She's very relatable. She does absolutely care for Madoka Kaname, and she does absolutely want to live the values that Mami showed and demonstrated when she was helping the other people in episode 2. She's, as we said in the course of these couple episodes that you can see in episode 1 and episode 2, she's not stupid. In fact, she's probably the smartest character in the show. But the pressures surrounding her, the kind of situation she's been put into, are deeply, deeply regrettable. So we can finally see the shadows creep into the brilliant white shot as Madoka cries in Sayaka's arms. And Kyubey's words are again kind of not twisted, but leading. It points out that things like killing the familiars are not something that other magical girls will do, and we see that later with Kyoko. Again, more pressure for Sayaka to carry on Mami's legacy. One of the things I've always found interesting about the character of Kyubey is how it does avoid lying, but it still manipulates. And I think it's a really good example of how language is a very difficult thing to deal with. See, for example, it stops Sayaka and says, you don't have the right to criticize other magical girls. As you are not one yourself. This feels kind of like a really Japanese kind of mindset, because here in America, we criticize people right and left. Oh my God, we don't hold that same type of viewpoint, or that would be laughed at. And a wider thing of, social pressures to society versus individualism in different cultures are something intrinsic to this work that doesn't really get brought up all that much, and is not really that important, but it is kind of for this scene. Madoka feels she's being selfish, and you can kind of see that mindset in these shadows. Also, just an absolutely beautiful transition on her with the long shadows. I'm sorry, seemingly say it's a Cube, but then a black screen and the name of Mami coming up. I made a video about when characters say one thing that has multiple meanings, referencing a place further in the universe, but this is another great example of how you would do it. She's apologizing to Mami, of course. She's apologizing to Cube, and she's also apologizing to society, Sayaka. Really, just to everyone, because she feels like a failure. The next scene is 30 seconds long, or thereabouts, and is just incredibly powerful. First, you've got her there alone. It says a lot that Sayaka went to Kyosuke instead of coming with Madoka to Mami's house. You've got this magnificent lighting, again with the setting sun and just the complete orange, washed out look to it. Heavy, dark shadows this time, though. Obviously, the symbol of the teacup comes up again. 2 separate shots. This is a place where the teacup was whole. And Madoka putting the drawings that she made and showed to Mami, or were inspired by what Mami had done on the table. Do you know where this comes back? This comes back in episode 12, when Kyoko and Mami are here together after Madoka makes her wish in the beginning, and Mami hands back this exact notebook to Madoka. The notebook then is kind of a symbol of the person Madoka could be. When we said in episode 3 her wish is going to be the exact same as what she makes in episode 12, just amplified by Homer's actions, then this is it. This is like her surrendering that idea of now she has deferred this wish and those values that go along with Mami and what she held dear. That influence, that magnanimity, that altruism is all still in Madoka. Obviously it comes out later, but it's just been left here, left in a place where it could be associated with Mami, as the story is going to go other places. But it's, these small little things that really give Madoka the feeling of being heavily constructed and heavily pieced together and really fleshed out and thought about before the end of the show came about. When I talk about other shows that aren't as finely crafted that I still nonetheless love, something like Kill la Kill, it's these type of, premonitions or like foresight that the showmaker has here in Madoka Magica that so many other places fail to have, just for various reasons. And we come back in on the I'm sorry thing, really connecting this scene with the previous one, really hammering home the fact that Madoka knows she is taking an easy way out, or a cop out, or a coward's path as it appears. And it's kind of the final thing of Mami until she appears in episode 10. It's like the last bit. And it's really important that Homura comes in here, not only because she's now filling the void of senpai, of magical girl who knows more and is going to not really teach, but watch over the rest, but because of that surrender of those ideals. Madoka now has made a choice. She has not given in to the pressure to become a magical girl for Mami's sake or the memory of her. She's deferred it, and as Homura would like to completely avert it, she's not done that, but she's certainly deferred it. But wasn't that exactly what Homura's objective was? She didn't set out to crush Madoka's, passion for being a magical girl. She absolutely didn't set out to destroy those values or challenge them or, vilify the things that Mami stood for. Of course not. We see that later on when she interacts with Mami in episode 10. So it's kind of this scorched earth policy that Homura sacrificed and made the decision to sacrifice literally everything else other than letting Madoka fall on the sword. We see now, and with the benefit of, future sight, we can see that it's this corruption of values, or this withering away of things getting peeled off one by one, and, mommy's just being another one of those, or the values that mommy embodies being another one of those. And yeah, the show absolutely sets that up kind of in opposition to that, but if we look at Homer's actions, it's pretty clear that she doesn't really oppose that, or she doesn't really want to hurt mommy or see mommy hurt at all. But that kind of misdirection towards that is hand in hand with why mommy dies, everything we talked about in the previous episode. And it goes all the way back to her warning in episode 1, and she brings that up here. In the next scene, definitely take note of the lens flare on the sun. It's very reminiscent of the first time we saw Homer and the lens flare on the red light, and I would definitely connect it to kind of that last little bit of hope. Or Homer has a line here about, I was at least able to change your fate, so that's one person I saved. Or, this whole story is Homer kind of clinging on to that last little bit of hope until she decides not to turn back time that last time. But it's kind of being squashed, it's kind of stretching out, it's kind of growing thinner and thinner. Another connection, and that we should have brought up in episode 1, is the red string of fate, which is something that is brought up a number of times throughout the show itself, but is directly referenced with the hair ribbons in episode 12, that some people can be intrinsically connected. And the show does a lot to show Homer bound to Madoka, and vice versa. This is a great little symbol for that, while keeping the tone and the mood and the shadows and the lighting of the entire show so far. Note that when Madoka breaks down, she's not consoled in the same way as she was when she was with Sayaka earlier in the episode. Also, they do the reflective writing thing again here. Madoka laments at mommy's loneliness and how no one will ever know that what she did was positive and made a good influence on the world. And of course, look at who she's saying it to. So, also note here that Homer, again, kind of talks in these absolutes, or makes these assumptions in much the same way that Sayaka did, in exactly the same way that mommy did. And yeah, it's kind of this whole thing of setting themselves up to be trapped in this system. She says it's a fate all magical girls must meet. She says it's dependent on our contract, or a result of our contract. Like, it's unavoidable, right? And to her, of course, it is unavoidable, because she can't conceive or think of things in a way that would allow them to break the system. If she could, she wouldn't be trapped in here for thousands of days of repeating the same horrific things over and over again. And then another hint of Homura being somewhat connected to Madoka, or that she wants Madoka's adoration with her line on how I envy mommy. And then, of course, Madoka puts the same weight on Homura, or she gives her this type of love. And yeah, it's just capitalizing on all the things that we've already said about how Madoka views the world, the never-ending compassion for other people, knowing that she's a magical girl too, and then she has to go through this horrible thing, knowing that Homura saved their lives, sure. Homura gives the line of you're too kind, and that kindness would lead to tragedy. Once again, Homura being unreliable, or not able to answer in full to the genre that she's in, or she's transgressing against, obviously is going to say something like that's a weakness, right? That Madoka's effusive words really do, in her mind, lead to Madoka falling on the sword and giving up everything. And yeah, her dying. Which in a lot of ways, they certainly do, and even at the end of episode 12, yeah, they certainly do. There might even be something about the act of, having compassion that leads to ultimate sacrifice. That once you can see beyond your own issues, or once you can empathize with other people, then you can know that their trials and tribulations and their struggles are worth more than anything that you've got going on, and you find a cause worth dying for. I mean, this whole story is about Homer rejecting that choice that Madoka makes there, and then about recontextualizing that into breaking the system. But for right now, we have to understand that Homer does not value those traditional magical girl values of self-sacrifice. Let's move on to the parallel scene with Sayaka and Kyosuke in the hospital. Direct callback to the previous two, right? Same establishing shot, same shot composition. We can also tell it's happening in parallel to Madoka's scene because of the lighting. We note that the flower is gone, so maybe Kyosuke wasn't the flower. Maybe the hope was the flower. Also note that Kyosuke is listening to the girl with the flaxen hair. I don't know if there's any special references in there. I don't know classical music that much, but I can tell you that Sayaka is not a girl with flaxen hair. Blue is definitely one of those that's a spin-off of black. And if you translate it into lighter or darker hair colors, then Sayaka definitely, removed from the anime world, would not have blonde hair. I do think it's a bit of foreshadowing that Kyosuke is never going to reciprocate Sayaka's feelings. Another quick little reference is the bag full of CDs reads MEE, probably for like music, entertainment, electronics, something like that. But if we're already in the mindset of Sayaka being selfish or making a selfish action here, then yeah, me is a large call out. And I think more thematically that this scene is pretty powerful, you know, that events in this world can cause a character to lose all hope. But if you think about it in the terms of like Kyosuke's injury and what he would do after his injury, like sure, he is a violin player and has that as his identity, and he's going through the pains of losing that now. However, that happens all the time. That happens all the time to people. They lose some element of themselves, or they're forced to adjust, or they're forced to become somebody else. He's not dead. His life is not over. I don't think you could tell that to him in this instance. I don't think he's willing to hear that right at this second, but with the benefit of time and emotional support, he could probably go on living just fine. Find a new passion, compose music instead of play it. I don't know, be a critic. You know, there's tons of things you could do tangentially to just playing. And to be fair, he's what, like 15? So yeah, of course he doesn't know. He doesn't have the context for how to redefine himself. And I think this really touches on one of the criticisms that I've heard leveled against Madoka Magica as a show, is that it feels a bit melodramatic in this way. Stuff like this is a bit much. However, I think that's an element of it being so focused that we don't see Kyosuke when he's normal, right? Because that doesn't serve the purposes of the story. We don't see him overcoming this because it's not a story about Kyosuke's struggle to redefine himself. No. The only thing we need from Kyosuke to further this story is for him to affect Sayaka. And therein, as a tool, he needs to be, one, able to do what he needs to do, but two, believable. So is it believable that a 15-year-old violin virtuoso would, after being told that he's never going to be able to play the violin again through a cruel twist of fate, then have an emotional outburst about that? His line that the doctors told him this, and that Sayaka doesn't know, makes it seem that it just happened recently. So of course, spiraling into grief in that moment, when you've told there's no hope and there's no medical way to fix this, is going to be something that any character is going to do for at least a little while. And a teenager, of course. So it passes that believability check. And the way he speaks about it, rather unfortunately, passes that manipulation check. Not deliberate manipulation, but for the purposes of the story and getting Sayaka where she needs to go for her story, then yeah, it's a manipulation there. Like, it would need a miracle to fix it. And then the shot of Sayaka saying miracles and magic do exist. I really love this one because when something is so personal to a character, or when it's very important, they possess more of the screen in the directing. So this is the closest we get to Sayaka. This is the most intimate we can get to Sayaka. And both rationally, because she's obviously seen it, and then firsthand through a belief sense, she knows that miracles and magic do exist, of course. And then we could criticize Sayaka in the same type of melodramatic way, that she immediately jumps to, oh, I can make a wish and I need to do it now. But I say to you, why would we expect her to do anything otherwise? She has no support. She doesn't run this by anybody. She has no one to run it by. She doesn't really share anything about Kyosuke with Madoka either. She has no parents to inform her of how to handle these types of grief situations. This seems like the end of the world to her. So honestly, I think it's more believable that Sayaka would go make this wish immediately after seeing Kyosuke in such pain than it would be for her to do literally anything else. Keep in mind that we have all this foreshadowing too that we talked about in the previous 4 videos. We've said she's looking for a reason. We've said she wants to honor mommy. We said she wants to do it so Madoka won't. Kyosuke slamming his hand down on the CD and inflicting physical pain that he'll never feel is just the straw that breaks the camel's back. And once again, we have a really subtle change in the lighting here with the stark black shadows. And the lighting change continues as we're later in the day in still staring at shadows. There are so very many shots of people walking or people's feet in this show that I definitely believe it's a huge cost-saving measure on the part of Shaft. But we're back at those ideas that we expressed earlier in the start of this video of making progress but not going anywhere, of taking action just to take some action, even if it's walking in circles, of not knowing which direction to go. And there's this one little question here that Madoka raises just in a brief heartbeat before the plot comes in with Hitomi. She has this line of, talking with Homer wasn't bad and we could have been friends, and why didn't mommy get along with her? And it's kind of tragic that that line of thinking isn't explored more, because then Madoka might arrive at the answer sooner, or like those values of, you know, understanding each other and not writing people off as enemies. The folly of drawing lines in the sand might be exposed more, you know, especially relevant for episode 5, right? But it's just to say that for Madoka, this is obvious, but for mommy, it was obvious in the other way, the complete opposite way. It's lamentable. I really only have a couple thoughts on this whole scene before we get to Ellie and what happens in the Witch's Labyrinth. First, I want to hit on kind of the abstract relationship between the grief of the characters here and the witch's power over them. I'm not quite sure that this is an accurate representation of a suicide cult, nor do I think it's kind of meant to be. That's just to say it's really hard to find a touchstone in the real world to what's going on here. We can understand from the man's comments that he failed and he has given up hope. However, we see Hitomi affected by the witch's kiss, and she doesn't, as far as we can tell, have any really reason why she has given up hope. Maybe we could possibly say that she has some of her feelings for Kyosuke that she's given up on or hasn't realized here, or that have thrown her into despair, but we don't see that, so it kind of makes it awkward that she's here. And she also has this crazy talk about the suicide, leaving the bodies and everything. Now, in the context of the magic of the show, absolutely that makes sense. If magical girls become witches, spoilers, then the normal characters kind of embrace the grief by committing the suicide, and I don't know whether that's a direct correlation to a witch, but it's the same thing that happens with Sayaka and with the magical girls. They fall into despair, they let their grief consume them, and then they become a witch. So in the scene, we see characters that are kind of doing that, they're just not magical girls. So instead of ending up as a witch, they just end up dead. It would make sense that they want to surrender their bodies and go to a new world. Hitomi in this scene is probably one of the weakest things in the show, to be honest with you. I also really think it's really stupid that they have a flashback here. That, like, the show has to explain to you that hydrochloric acid and bleach create chlorine. I don't know, I think it would have worked just as well if they didn't have a whole flashback to Monika's mom. That's weird. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's no more weird or bad than any other magical girl show, honestly. Really, it's kind of what you would expect from any type of episodic plot in any type of, more normal magical girl show. But we've already established we're not in a normal magical girl show. We're established that we're not doing the episodic thing. So this being kind of a nano episode is just like awkward, you know? And it's not like Madoka's choice to stop this suicide from occurring is revealing or anything about her. I mean, I love the shot after she throws the bucket out the window. I think that's absolutely gorgeous. Like, look at the shadows under her eyes, framed with the jagged edges of the glass, really give a beautifully dangerous representation of her mentality right now. Oh, the other thing I wanted to bring up is just, again, we go back to that contrivance that Madoka doesn't have anybody's phone number. Like, the events of the show would be completely different if people had cell phones. That one I generally think is as forgivable as it was the first time, but still, I don't know. I do want to say, though, that this entire scene does succeed on the surface level of, equating the people to zombies, of giving this incredible tension to, oh boy, Madoka might actually be in legitimate danger right here. And that extends into the Witch's Labyrinth. Really quickly, I want to say that on the Madoka Magica wiki, we can see here that in the interview with Ken Urobuchi about this episode, he states that he didn't write anything for this labyrinth. There was no direction, there was no idea for what this was going to be. And Inu Kuri came in and took over and created literally everything about this scene. So when we have this beautiful symbol of Madoka, saying this is her punishment and that she deserves this for being weak and then being literally pulled apart, that's incredibly beautiful, that's incredibly poignant. And it's good on Inu Kuri for, making that connection and putting that symbol in there. Another thing from the wiki is that Ellie made a wish to like seal a memory away, and that's kind of why Madoka sees in the monitors these ideas of Mommy's past and what happened last episode. That extends to the shot right before Sayaka finishes off Ellie, when it's still showing what happened last episode in the monitor, and Sayaka destroys that memory. And, you know, that's kind of a weird symbol or a warning sign or something that isn't going to obviously end out well because she's responded with aggression to it. She'll learn acceptance, but not until episode 12. And I think this is a very nice symbol for her rejecting Mommy's ultimate fate and responding by fighting back. Another small shot thing here as Homer watches on. This shot was deliberately changed in the original TV airing. It looks like she's standing on some sort of monkey bars situation, or some pipes or something. However, in the Blu-ray, it's changed to be a decorative lamppost. So too is the crescent moon changed to be hollow on the right side. I don't know how much of a reach this is, but whenever I see somebody standing on top of a lamppost watching over magical girls fighting, I think of Tuxedo Mask. And in that supportive and protectorate role, he's very much a kindred soul to what Homer is doing right now. However, the crescent moon is traditionally associated with Sailor Moon, especially to the point where it's completely unrealistic in its depiction of a crescent. It goes far too far or past the normal moon. So in this way, I think the shot definitely references Sailor Moon, but I think the message behind the symbol is that Homer is both heroine and protector of heroine. Now, for this last minute and a half scene, I really want to state that it's big tonally here. This is not a triumph. This is positioned by the show as a failure. First, we get the shot of the people waking up from the witch's kiss, but they're not shown to be happy or thankful or renewed or energetic. They still look dead. And now directly contrast that with the woman who attempted suicide after the witch was slain. What did Mommy do? Mommy was right there to console her. What is Sayaka doing? Justifying to Madoka what she's done. We'll talk about her character design next episode. But one of the first things Sayaka says is, "Don't worry, I'll be okay." So even she is aware that not only is she in danger, but she kind of fucked up already. We've established that there were a number of things that pushed her into making her wish, but now we see that there's a number of things that are on the other side, that are imbuing her with a sense of guilt for doing what she's done. And I think it's to their credit that they're not able to vocalize it. Both Homura and Madoka here aren't able to call her out and place blame at her feet. Listen to the hollowness of the wind as Homura appears. There isn't any Credence Justitam. There isn't even Sayaka's theme in the background here. We've seen her be associated capriciously with the wind and being blown in whichever way the circumstances lead her. And here's another thing that's really important. Homura comes in and is indignant towards Sayaka. How could you? One, this kind of shows that Homura cares for Sayaka. Though her goal is Madoka, she would certainly rather Sayaka not be involved and not get hurt. She also doesn't have any precognition here. She's surprised. And I think she's angry because she's beginning to fail. This was a timeline where both of them were supposed to not get involved, but Homura here sees it slipping away with Sayaka's wish. If something like that is going to happen, it's hard to believe that Madoka's fate could be changed as well. Also, just a really basic thing for social interactions in general, if you use a synecdoche to stand in for somebody else's name, then you are deliberately reducing them, or you're intending to insult them. Sayaka takes up right where Mommy left off in writing Homura off as less than she is. This adds tonally to the negative feeling of this scene, especially when we move now to Kyosuke. We aren't seeing the happiness, oh my god, it's a miracle, you know, we're not seeing his joy. And it's over top of the low, ominous, droning tone, whereby it is revealed what Sayaka wished for. There's still darkness all around. There's still that little bit of lens flare and blurriness on the outside of all of the character animation that goes and symbolizes moonlight, but also confusion. There's still these very dark, stark, and ominous shadows. This is shot as if it's a horror, not something that should be celebrated. And this tone informs us as to how we are to take Sayaka's decision. And to both add into that and draw from it, we see the first introduction of Kyoko to the series. She is introduced hunched over with unkempt hair, tearing apart food with her mouth. Her fang is always visible. She speaks in a lower diction than many of the other characters, and she talks in threats. Everything from her design to introducing her wide awake nocturnally associates Kyoko with being animalistic. I'd also like to point out the symbol of the wind comes back for Kyoko, just as it did for Homura. So maybe instead of Sayaka's capriciousness, we can interpret the wind as now moving from Sayaka onto the other two, as kind of like ripples from an effect that Sayaka has blown one way, and now that shock wave is being felt by both Homura and Kyoko. At the very least, it has a strong flowing connotation. As for the dialogue, a couple things just plot structurally wise. Kyoko knew Mami, which we know from the extended universe they had a history together, and they'll be shown to be very close in Rebellion and in other works. This just positions Mami as someone who was powerful enough to hold her own against somebody like Kyoko, or scare Kyoko away. Again, in this very kind of animalistic territory ideal, we're going to be shown visually, but also otherwise, that Sayaka is just simply not as powerful in the scale as any other magical girl in this show. And there appears to be some type of contradiction here. Kyubei states that it didn't expect Kyoko to show up. However, Kyoko states that Kyubei gave her information regarding the passing of Mami. It seems incredibly unlikely that Kyubei would not think that Kyoko would show up after saying that to her. One way to rectify this is considering that Kyoko's decision to come to Mitakihara would be immediate and impulsive. Kyubei wouldn't understand the emotions behind it. Basically, that it misunderestimated Kyoko. Another way we could rectify it is that Kyubei just does lie straightforwardly, so then it lies about lying later in the show. Either way, one last connection, and I think we'll talk a lot about the parallels between Sayaka and Kyoko and their stories and their attitudes coming up, but we see the first one already. When Kyoko talks about the actions of another person, that Sayaka made her wish, or that Kyubei allowed that wish to happen, she states that that pisses me off. I mean, we've heard somebody else state that that pisses me off when Sayaka was talking about the actions of Homura in episode 2. It shows them as impulsive and emotive, but also rude in a way that they have little concern for the niceties and politesse of the world. They're both very headstrong and not afraid to say things that they think should be said. Either way, I'm really looking forward to getting more into the series itself. In all honesty, I think episode 4 may be the weakest overall single episode in the entire show. While the directing is very strong throughout, and I think the witch in this episode is one of the best, most interesting visually, episode 4 generally has a pretty weak second half. However, we've moved the story forward, we've gotten Sayaka to take her action, and it feels believable and relatable and entirely in line with where we see this story going. Next episode, I really want to talk about Kyoko's role to the series, what she means from our perspective as a foil for Sayaka, and generally how their already formed mindsets are going to contrast and then change over the course of the show. We absolutely have to go over Sayaka and Kyoko's magical girl outfit and character designs though. Also of note, episode 5 may be delayed because I have purchased a house and I will be moving into my new house over the course of the next month. So my time to make these may be a little bit less. Anyway, once again, thank you for sticking with me and finding some value in these.